and in their value. Research consistently shows that strong school library programs staffed by qualified librarians correlate with improved student achievement, particularly in reading and information literacy. Libraries also serve crucial functions beyond just housing books. They're often centers for collaboration, technology access, and developing research skills. There's also evidence that school libraries help to address educational inequities and are very much in alignment with the state's efforts to increase student literacy. However, school libraries are chronically underfunded and understaffed, and we know that improved literacy is a goal in our state, hence the READ Act, a statewide effort to improve early literacy, particularly for students in kindergarten through third grade. When it comes to literacy, school libraries not only provide essential resources like books and technology, but also offer personalized support, encourage reading for pleasure, and contribute to a positive learning environment, all of which are crucial for improving students' literacy outcomes. We heard from many of you who registered for this webinar that you'd like to learn more about how to use this data to advocate for support for school libraries, and that's a big part of our intent today. And just some background about the multi-county, multi-type library systems. The systems work to improve services and facilitate cooperation among the various library types in 7 regions across the state. Directors and staff from the MCMT worked closely with Counting Opinions and Wilder to collect the census data and develop the executive summary and final report, the results of which we're bringing you today. And the 7 regions are Arrowhead Library System, Central Minnesota Libraries Exchange, MetroNet, Northern Lights Library Network, Prairie Lands Library Exchange, Southeast Library System, and Traverse des Sioux Library System. So to the census. The census was conducted in spring of 2024 by Counting Opinions and included all eligible K-12 public and charter schools across the state. The findings from the census provide a variety of invested parties such as yourselves, legislators, school administrators, school library staff, and families with information about the support schools and LMC staff currently have and need to preserve and strengthen school library programs. So who answered the survey? Respondents were largely school staff who managed the Library Media Center. Most are licensed media specialists, teachers, or paraprofessionals. There was high participation in the census with 1,528 out of 1,777 schools responding, which is a really high number for a survey with no incentive attached to it. The survey was quite lengthy at about 65 questions, and information about criteria for eligibility can be found in the overall report. And I'll pass it back to Anna now to talk about the results a bit more.
Thanks, Ashley. You heard that we had a really good response to this survey. So if we look a little closer at who responded, Annie, you can go to the next slide. We can see that there's a pretty good distribution across school types and classifications. So the majority of responses came from independent and special school districts. Over half came from elementary schools across the state. And you can see the distribution here in this table. There was good representation from greater Minnesota and some of the lesser populated areas of Minnesota. So you can see it's almost half and half between the Twin Cities Metro and greater Minnesota. 38% in urban centers, 54% in urban, and 8% in rural areas. And responses were received from across all 7 multi-county, multi-type library system regions, with the largest proportion from MetroNet in the Twin Cities 7-county metro. So really good responses to this survey, fairly representative. And so we can feel pretty confident in some of these results. So there are a few definitions that might be helpful. You'll hear me refer to LMCs, which are library media centers. And there is a statutory definition that you can look up. And LMSs, which are licensed media specialists. You might hear the word media specialist used colloquially, but when we're referring to a licensed media specialist in this context, it means someone who has specific state certification. So we looked at things like staffing from this survey, and we'll dig into that a little bit. And there, I mentioned the statutory definition of a school library media center, and that is in Minnesota State Statute 2023, Section 124D 911. So you can look at that if you did not know there was a definition. So what did we learn? The big question. So I'll start out here with a graphic we have that really provides an average of a Minnesota school library media center, or LMC. Now these are averages. In this case, these are medians. So it's kind of the middle number. So please understand there is a wide range of realities here, but this kind of paints a general picture of where we're at in Minnesota. So if you look at some of the light blue numbers, so on average, there's about 432 students served by a library media center with an average of 24 books per student. There's an average of 40 hours of total paid staff time. And this is across all staff that may be employed at the LMC. So it could be a combination of part-time staff or just one person that's working 40 hours per week. That's the average. And it's usually about 1 to 2 staff that are employed as part of the library in the school. The average budget is $5,000 for the school year. And that comes out to an average of $10.99 per student. And if we look at collection size and age, there's an average of 11,000 books, and they're 17 years old on average. So half of the LMCs have schools that are old, books that are older than that, and half have books that are not that old, but more recent. So next I want to talk about how many schools actually have a library media center. So we found from this census that 81% of schools in Minnesota reported that they have a library media center, or what I'll refer to as an LMC. 5% responded saying they don't have one, and for 14% of schools, we just don't know. However, it's probably more likely that they don't have one given the nature of the census request. Even though schools without a media center were encouraged to respond to the survey, they may have felt it wasn't important to because they don't have an LMC, but we don't know that for sure. It's also important to note that respondents weren't given a clear definition of what a library media center is. Say per state statute. So this 81% may be less if respondents had been provided a really strict definition of sorts. So they could look like a variety of things across schools. Among schools with a library media center, 15% share that library media center with another school. So this could be schools that share a building. So 81% have a library media center according to the census information. So one point we really want to hit home today is that staffing is not adequate for many library media centers. The census aimed to understand how many schools have a media center that is served by a licensed media specialist. So this is a person that holds a license issued by the Professional Educator Licensing Board, or PELSB, not just someone who is maybe colloquially referred to as a media specialist. And state statute now requires that all library media centers be served by an LMS, a licensed media specialist, to technically be considered an LMC. So if we actually use the state statute definition, only about 46% rather than 81% would have a true LMC according to this standard of having a licensed media specialist managing it. If schools are not served by a licensed media specialist, school libraries are most often managed by a paraprofessional or a teacher without a media license. And school library aid is being provided by the state to support schools to fund these positions, among other things, given that this is newly part of the state statute. So there's currently a discrepancy here between state statute and actual staffing practices in the schools and districts. So we can take a little closer look at what staffing looks like. So let me orient you to this chart so that the first column shows whether a school has full-time, part-time, or no licensed media specialist staff. So the full green person is a full-time person, half, and then nobody. And the middle column shows staff without a media license. So most important here is that 44% only have staff without a media license. And you'll see in the note below that an additional 2% are simply run by volunteers or aren't staffed by anyone. So no staff at all, or just volunteers. So then I want to draw your attention to the kind of orange circle at the bottom, to the 6%. So according to the American Association of School Librarians, which is a national association, every school library should be staffed by a full-time licensed media specialist and full-time support staff, some people that are highly trained technical and clerical support staff. And really up from there, kind of depending on the school size and needs. So according to this standard, only 6% of schools have the recommended staffing level. So not only are we pretty far from meeting requirements in state statute, we're extremely far from the standards that are recommended by the American Association of School Librarians. Among schools that reported having a licensed media specialist employed in the LMC, more than half, 53%, were staffed at less than full-time. So less than 37.5 hours per week is how we define full-time. Respondents shared what they think are the most common reasons for a lack of a licensed media specialist in their school. And the responses that rose to the top were really that it was a district or school staffing decision, that there was a lack of funding, and that there was an inability to find a qualified LMS candidate. So those were the top reasons provided. And here's a quote that exemplifies the staffing challenges that some schools are experiencing. There were plenty of open ends with comments like this. And 25% of respondents, so these are people managing the school library, regardless of whether they have a media license or not, reported that they're working in more than one school. This can also include someone, though, that is working within one building, but serving two schools. So it's not necessarily meaning that they're traveling from place to place, but I'm sure some of that 25% are folks that are doing that. So we found that many licensed media specialists split their time across more than one school. Of those who are working in more than one school, about half are working in 2 media centers. But you can see here that nearly 1 in 5 are serving 5 or more media centers. So you can safely assume that those individuals are traveling to schools, because you usually don't have 5 schools in one building. And you probably wouldn't want a media center serving 5 separate schools. So in general, library media centers benefit from having district oversight. So there were some questions about that in the census. A district level person that provides oversight can provide leadership for building level media specialists and support staff. They can serve as the licensed library media educator for building level library media centers. They can provide support services to library media centers in the district, and they can support budget and finances. But we found that almost half of schools don't have this type of oversight from their district. And then there were some questions about accessibility, how available the library is to kids at the schools. Ideally, media centers are open for students during the entire school day and before and after school hours. But over half of schools don't have that kind of availability. 56% of schools have their LMC open 30 hours or less each week. Now, what are licensed library media center staff spending their time on? Ideally, the person managing the media center is doing library-related administrative work, providing instruction for students, and are also doing things like providing professional development for staff, such as in-service sessions and advising on student needs. And they're collaborating with teachers to design and assess curriculum. According to the data, this might not be happening on the scale that one would hope. So if we go to the next slide. So here we can see respondents were asked to report the proportion of time they spend on each of these tasks. So they were given this list and they said, they were asked, what percentage of time do you spend on each of these pieces? So the percentages you're seeing here are averages or means of the proportions reported by all respondents who answered the question. So it's kind of confusing to read, but it does give you a sense of where they're spending their most time. And you can see that the percentages for collaborating with teachers and providing professional development are pretty small, especially compared to this other category. So the most common tasks respondents perform outside of the list provided, placed in this other category, were things like technology support, digital tech integration, device management, clerical tasks, teaching, subbing, supporting other school activities or programs like study hall or lunch, and other duties as assigned. And ideally, you wouldn't have a licensed media specialist doing this work. Granted, there are a lot of paraprofessionals in this role that are pulled in other directions. So this data may be an indication that those running the media center don't have enough time or capacity to do all of the aspects of their job, or what would ideally be part of their job, or that they're not expected to be doing these kinds of things in their role because maybe they lack the training. Like I said, for example, you wouldn't expect a paraprofessional to provide professional development to teachers or staff. But this is an essential component of having an effective school library program. So for those who responded that they provide instruction to students, they were asked what content they teach. And ideally, these numbers would all be 100% or close to it. But given that many LMCs are not staffed by licensed professionals or are understaffed with few hours or a small number of staff, it makes sense that these numbers don't reach 100%. It's possible that with better staffing and protected time and value from administration in these areas, these numbers might be higher. So respondents were asked to rank their top 3 challenges. So this analysis combines responses and reports the percentage of respondents that selected each option as one of their top 3. So the largest proportion of respondents, 67%, 2/3, selected budget and funding sources as one of their top challenges. Probably not a surprise to anybody on this webinar. One could interpret this as validation that the current school library aid that's being provided to schools is of great value. The other challenges leading in order down is collection, development, and maintenance, more staff persons or hours needed, administration's value of library or library media specialists, duties assigned that are unrelated to the library. So being pulled into other things that don't involve the library. And then the conditions of facilities and furnishings. And a stark one for me is that 42% of respondents identified duties as assigned that are unrelated to the library as one of their top challenges. That seems like something that could be addressed or is kind of trending in some of this data that we're seeing. In addition to selecting top challenges, respondents were invited to share additional comments, open-ended comments about what is challenging in their job. And the largest proportion sort of reiterated some of these themes that we're hearing. So the need for more staff or hours to carry out the duties of their job, noting that they're often pulled into other work duties, and finding that the library budget is kind of inadequate to do their work effectively. Many also noted challenges related to staff positions or hours being cut and concerns about that. So again here, not so much challenges, but respondents were asked to select their top priority, their top 3 priorities. So this analysis combines responses and reports the percentage of respondents that selected each option as one of their 3 top priorities. So about 3/4 noted an increase in the library materials budget as a top priority, a much higher proportion than a lot of the other options listed. And you can see other things that were selected by about 1/3 of the respondents as priorities for them. Among the 30% in the other category, the most common priorities related to specific staffing needs. So increasing paid hours or full-time employment for staff to complete tasks like weeding, admin time, checking out books, having a full-time licensed media specialist at each school rather than having their time split, and keeping current licensed staff rather than cutting staff. So the census asked questions about collections. And as mentioned earlier in the graphic at the beginning, the median collection size across respondents was 11,000 books and approximately 24 books per pupil. However, the number of books per pupil varies greatly across schools, and you can look at some of the more regional data in the infographics that we have available. But regardless of the number of books in a school library, it's imperative that collections are curated to maintain relevance, improve access, maximize space, and enhance quality. And the fact that books were on average about 17 years old, and you think of all that's happened within the past 17 years, you do want those to be as up to date as possible. So another item on the census was about decision making. Respondents were asked to assign proportions related to who makes the decision about how the LMCs are staffed and funded. So respondents said that about 60%, it's about 60% of the district's decision, 30% of the school principal's decision, and then the 10% remaining was other factors that play into it. And open-ended responses provided a little more nuance, indicating that districts often make overall funding decisions and school principals decide how to distribute those funds within the school. So it just provides a little bit of information about how those decisions are typically made, who the decision makers are. But again, it varies greatly across school, across region. So this is statewide. So the census also asked about library media center budgets. So budget categories included funding from the district, school, fundraising, like PTA, PTO, and book fair, the school library aid, and other sources. Other responses, other sources most often included funding from grants and donations. And respondents were asked to exclude budgets spent on salaries or benefits, furniture, and printing. So there are some limitations to the amount of detail we can report on these data due to data quality, but we did look at the distributions of total budget amounts. So more than half of schools have an LMC budget of less than 5,000, and you can see the distribution. And this is supposed to include the state school library aid. And again, the median amount per student is about $10.99. And for context, an average book costs anywhere between $10.15 to $32.22, depending on the audience. So most schools spend the majority of their media center budget on books and materials. The way we reported this was kind of constrained by the way the survey question was asked. So respondents were asked to report the proportion of their budget that they spend on these various components. So reported here are averages of those reported proportions. Yeah, hard to wrap your head around, but for example, 75% in that lower left-hand corner, 75% of respondents reported that they spend none of their budget on makerspace or tech for student use. Alternatively, in the upper right-hand corner, 86% reported that they spend anywhere between 50 to 100% of their budget on books and materials. So that if that helps you read the chart a little bit, I hope that's helpful. So a little bit about the school aid, which many of you may be familiar with. So in 2023, school districts and charter schools were eligible to receive an automatic distribution of state aid, calculated at the greater of $16.11 per adjusted pupil unit for the current year, or $40,000 for school districts and $20,000 for charter schools. Schools didn't need to apply for funding. It was distributed by the Minnesota Department of Education as part of the entire aid package to districts and schools, and the funding is ongoing. While we don't have any data to suggest that schools misuse these funds, if the intention of this legislation was to build up and strengthen existing programs or start new ones, we have some data to suggest that the funds were not always used to that end. Certainly, many times it was, and we heard that when we presented these data to the Education Finance Committee in the Senate. We heard some amazing stories, but some of this data is a little, from the census, is a little bit disappointing in terms of the awareness of this funding and knowledge about how it was used and how it affected students. So you would expect that those running the media centers on the ground, doing the work, would be aware of this funding and really feel the impact. So we asked, the survey asked respondents whether they were aware of the funds received by their school. And of all respondents, 40% said that they were unaware of these funds, didn't really know they existed. And of those who said they were aware of the funds, nearly half, or 49%, reported they were unaware of the impact of those funds on the school library. So they knew that the funds had come from the state, but they were just unaware of how those funds benefited the media center. So you can see here, this kind of spells out what folks were asked when asked about the impact on the school. So for those who were aware of the funding that had come in, how did it impact the school? And you can see, well, 49% said they just weren't aware of that funding. And 24% said it was used to maintain staffing levels from the previous year. So that's the highest percentage in terms of what we know anyways of how it was used. And then the next is for additional funding for library materials, which aligns with the need for more funding for collections and materials. So in open-ended responses, some shared that they felt the funds had been used to supplant funds that were then used elsewhere within the schools, not necessarily to strengthen the media center, but maybe only to preserve what is already there, which of course is a value as well, which according to state statute is a perfectly acceptable use of the funds. We don't have any data that suggests how often funds were supplanted in this way, but of those who knew how the funds impacted the media center, the largest proportion did report it was used to maintain the previous year's staffing levels. So if the intention of the legislation was to strengthen and build up library programs, there might be some room for improvement there. And again, we heard some amazing stories about how that aid was used by school libraries across the state in front of the Senate committee. So now that was a lot of information, and Ashley's kind of going to wrap up some kind of takeaways, some recommendations, and some ideas for advocacy. And then it would be great to hear your questions and hear if you have any ideas for how this information can be used for advocacy or other purposes. All right, Ashley, thanks.
Thanks, Anna. So results from the census indicate that school libraries are struggling and need support. By adequately staffing library media centers and equipping them with the resources necessary to update and expand their collections, Minnesota can improve access to the knowledge, tools, and literacy students need to succeed. Buy-in from state, district, and school leaders on the value of school libraries is critical to equipping them with the proper resources and ensuring they realize the full benefits of aid provided by the state. So the first insight is that there's more work to be done to ensure all schools have a library media center. There are many reasons why schools may not have a media center, but as we know, research consistently shows that students need access to a well-resourced, well-staffed library. The second one is that we need to there's a need to update the state statute regarding the use of school library aid. It's one of the many library-related items being debated in the legislature this session, and both the House and Senate have put forward bills restricting its use to the salaries and benefits of a school library media specialist, electronic and material resources, or furniture, equipment, or supplies. So tightening that up a little bit. In the governor's recommended budget, he recommended reducing the school library aid program by about $7.5 million in fiscal years 26 and 27, and 15 million in fiscal years 28, 29. And the House would repeal school library aid completely. The Senate maintains it in its full amount. And the third, school districts should hire licensed media specialists and support staff, support teachers and other staff in seeking licensure, and increase overall capacity of LMCs. Each school library needs at least one licensed library media specialist. Their time needs to be protected so that they're able to serve the media center effectively, and support staff need to be trained on library values like student privacy, and both media specialists and support staff need their hours increased. And the fourth one, more schools across Minnesota would benefit from district level staff supporting the work of licensed media specialists. Like Anna mentioned, that district level school library support can administer a district vision, advocate for equitable resources around the district, and can lead the implementation of national school library standards. And number 5, students and teachers will be better equipped for academic and instructional success with the support of a licensed media specialist. Without access to that person, students and teachers lose access to reading support, information literacy skills, supportive research projects, digital learning, and integration of technology into curriculum. And the last one we have is that schools need resources to curate their collections to meet the needs of students and a licensed media specialist to ensure this is done in a way that carries the greatest educational value. More funds are needed to support collection curation to improve the age of materials across the state. Students and teachers also need to be made aware of the free online resources provided to all Minnesotans through Minitex. And so there was requests for, advocacy, how to use this data. I guess for non-school library folks, I think there are some that registered. I think advocating for school libraries can start on a very local level. Know who is running your school library. Is it a licensed library media specialist? Is it a paraprofessional? What support do they need? How can you help them in getting that support? Know your elected officials and who's running for your school board and find out more about what their support for school libraries looks like. And a lot of these are just the suggestions of ways to be a civically minded resident in your community too. And for advocating with the data for people that are here from school libraries, I guess recognizing that there are systemic issues in our state and how school districts are funded that don't prioritize the hiring of media specialists. Are there ways to use the data to nudge your school in the right direction? So if you're looking at the data, especially if you want to use one of the region infographics to think about the budget, the average budget in the state, where is your school sit, the average collection age, is there ways to bump that a little bit closer to the average at least? Thinking about what time is being spent on and what content is taught. Like Anna said, a lot of those should all be at 100%, but we know that there's some gaps missing there. So are there ways to talk about what additional content needs to be taught? And then moving up the staffing scale, obviously, there's a very small percentage that are in that kind of ideal staffing ratio percentage, but if there are ways to just move the needle in one direction or another. And that is all we have. I think we'll open it up for questions. But if you can always get in contact with Anna or me if you want to talk about the data or anything else more specifically too.
Yeah, thanks. We'd love to open it up to questions you have. Was there anything that surprised you or that you would like to learn more about, or ways that you could see this information being used in a meaningful way?